My name is Daniel Abelsamed and my partner is Daniel Jakes, and we have created the CLI survey application. The goal of this application is to have three distinct parts: to manage the survey by means of adding questions, editing questions, and deleting questions, as well as deleting responses, to take the survey, and to generate reports on the survey.
Alright, so in our project, we have three different functionalities. We have a manage, a take, and a report tool. And we'll first go over the manage. And so we're first going to say we're going to show all questions. And before the video, we went ahead and added a few questions in here just for testing purposes. And as well with the responses, we can see the SQL queries right here logged out. And Daniel A will touch more on that later, but we'll do a few more with that flag and then we'll turn it off because it does clutter up the logs a little bit. Next one we're going to do is creating a question. So we'll create a question that says, what is your favorite pizza topping? With the choices sausage, bacon, and pepperoni. And once again, we have the insert clause to insert the question into our database. And if we go to show all questions, we can also see it in here, but I purposely put in a little typo here just so we can go back and edit it using the edit function. So we're going to go down here, choose it, and we're going to retype this. And now if we go to show all questions, then the edit tool went ahead and it fixed our typo in here. The next one we're going to be going over is deleting a question. So we're going to go ahead and just delete the question that we just created. And once again, show all questions, and now we are back to our original three. And the final function for the manage tool, we're going to delete the responses. These are all responses that we went ahead and put in here beforehand. And we're going to delete, let's get rid of Daniel J1. Oops. We're going to delete Daniel J1. And now if we go in there one more time, you can see Daniel J1 is nowhere to be seen. So that's the manage functionality, and the next one we're going to be going over is taking the exam.
In order to take the survey, all you have to do is type in survey take, and then you will be presented with what your name is. And you are only allowed to take the survey once, so the name must be unique. So in this case, I will type in my full name. And once I enter that, I will be presented with a different question. So in this case, my favorite ice cream flavor is chocolate, and I am a junior, and I do have a pet. And once the survey response has been submitted, it will tell the user that the response was successful and it has been added. For survey reporting, all you have to do is type in survey report, and after that you will be presented with three options. We programmed in seeing the question and answer distribution for a given question, to view the number of answering participants, and to view the number of questions. So to view the answer distribution, you first select view answer distribution, and then you'll be presented with the different questions within the survey. So if I wanted to see how many people have strawberry as their favorite ice cream, I could select this, and I can see that there were 6 responders who enjoyed strawberry, 4 for chocolate, and 2 for vanilla. It is sorted in descending order based on the number of responders. So the most popular question is always first. And I can show you with a different question. For example, with a true/false question, do you have a pet? We can see that there were 7 responders that said true and 5 responders that said false. The other options we have for survey reporting is to view the number of answering participants. So if we click here, we can see that there are a total of 12 responses. And if I see the number of questions, I can see that all of these surveys were presented with 3 questions. The first section of the code that we're going to discuss is the manage function. So the manage function has the showing all questions, creating questions, editing, etc. And I'm going to show you the show all questions code. So this code calls a function called get all questions, which will be discussed later. return all the questions, and all it does is iterates over those questions, and for every question it grabs the choices from the database using this select function where the question ID is equal to the one in question, and after it receives the choices it iterates over them and displays them to the console.
Right, for the create question code, we are first getting the question prompt from the user using the Inquirer or third-party library, as well as what type of question it is, either a multiple choice or a true-false question. Then creating a random 64-digit long ID that we're using to store and identify our questions and information in the database. If the question type is a multiple choice, then we obviously need to get next the answer choices and then split them by a comma just so we can get them all in a nice array to store them. And if the question type is a true false, we already have the answers provided to us. We're then taking the order we're getting the order of the question by simply taking all of the questions that we have, the count of them, plus 1, and then insert all of that into our questions database and insert the question choices into our table as well. Alright, going over edit question, our first step is to select a question, and the function that this comes from essentially displays all questions that are in the database and then uses Inquirer to let you select a question that you want to edit. And if a question is not sent, then there needs to be an error thrown or an error message. Then get the full question based on the prompt, and from there you edit the new prompt, and we use our query function, which Daniel A will be going over, to update the prompt to the new prompt in the database where the ID is the question ID, which we got from the first line here.
For deleting questions, it's actually quite simple. First, we ask the user which questions they'd like to delete using the select question right here. And we pass the prompt to that, and then we say true because the user can select to delete multiple questions if they'd like to. Then we check if there is no response. If there's no response or the array length is 0, we know that there's either no questions that they selected or there are no questions in the database. Then after that, we take those IDs returned from the select question function and say delete every question where that ID exists within the array of IDs up here. The other function we have is the delete response question, or the delete response function. So with this function, we first grab all of the responses from the database. So from the database table responses, we select the ID, the user ID, and the submission timestamp, and we order it by the submission timestamp descending. So the newest submission will occur first. So in case there's a lot of submissions, the newest one will appear first, as you'd likely want to deal with those. If there's no responses selected, there are either no responses in the database, so we instruct the user that they need to take the survey before you can delete a response. After that, we show all of the responses to the user by mapping over those responses and showing them the name, which is the user ID, and the submission timestamp padded together. And then the value of it is the ID, and the short response of it, so there's a quick list you can reference, is just the name of the user, not the date that they took it. And then we take those selected response IDs and we do the same thing as we did in the questions. And over the responses table, we delete the ID where the response is within the array, where the ID of the response is within the ID of the array of the selected responses. For viewing the answer distribution for a given question, we had to create a semi-complicated query to accomplish this. First, we ask the user which question they'd like to view the distribution on, and they only are allowed to select one, and once we get the question ID, we're able to continue. So for this query, from the response answers table, we want to select the value of the choice as well as how many people chose that answer. So we'll select the value and then the count. And then we also want to left join on the question choices table because from the user, we receive a question ID and then want to respond with the choices. So for every question ID, we want to map to the response answers table. So we'll say map every choice to a ID from the question choices table. So this right here says every time that question choices .id, so the table question choices, the ID on that table, is equal to the response answers .choice ID, we know those two fields are equal to each other. And there's actually a foreign key in the database set up to make sure that is true. And then after we link the question choices table, we can know that the question ID will link to that specific choice in the response answer by using this question choices table. So after we have that, we can input the question ID and only gather the responses from that question ID. And then we can group by the question choices.value, which is the value which is the value of the choice that they have selected. And then we can order by the count descending, and the count is defined up here in the select statement. So we can order that by descending so that the person with the choice with the most answers will be first. And then after we receive the responses from this query, we're able to output all of that one by one to the terminal by displaying first the value that will be padded so that everything lines up, a bar, and then the amount of the number of responses, and then an S if it's equal to 1.
Part of the analytics side of what we're doing in our application is we want to see the number of participants that have currently answered our survey, as well as the number of questions that are currently in there. So for each of these are pretty similar. We're using our query function to pull from each table the count of IDs in there, or in this case, just the number of responses that are in that table. And then they're logged out, doing some formatting as well, so everything looks nice no matter how many questions or participants are pulled from the table.
In general, to get this code to work, we used a lot of helper functions to make our lives easier. One of the most used helper functions is this query function right here that we use on every single connects query that we generate. And this goes down into this function, and this is what helps us log out all of the queries. So you can see down here, this is the meat of the query function. We basically await for the results of whatever query builder we used. So this will be the built query that we get the results for. And if we want to show queries, which is defined up here on whether this show queries value is set or not, down here we will go and show queries, and then we'll say which query we're executing by showing the query first without the bindings, so you don't see the values in there, and just leave it with the question marks. And then we splice in the bindings so that it's clear to the user what values were used. So depending on the situation, they can see either. And then at the very end, we return the results. And in here, we also have our ID generation function. So it's just a random 48-byte base64 string. The other functions we used were some general question util functionality. So multiple times throughout the application, we had to get all of the questions. So we created a simple function here to grab the ID in the prompt order by order for all of the questions and return that to the user or to the programmer. Down here on line 12, we have the select question, which is something we use multiple times throughout the application. You can either select one question or select multiple questions, for example, in the question deleting system. So first we use the get questions function above and get all the questions. And once we've loaded in the questions, if there are none, we short circuit and immediately tell the user that there are no questions in the database, that they need to create one before they can delete it. Then down here, if it's a multi-select, we use a checkbox style system, or if it's not, we use a list. As checkbox, you can select multiple, and for list, you can only select one. After that, we just iterate through the questions, and the name is going to be the prompt, and then the value that the code uses is going to be the ID, because that is our primary key in the database. For a list, it will only return a single element, and checkbox returns an array of elements, so we wanted to normalize that. So if it's a multi-select, we return the array as is, and if it's not a array, because it was returned by the list, we turn it into a single element array. When the command is executed, a whole bunch of things occur. The first thing that is called is the survey file here, and this is directly executable because we have the shebang statement at the top that describes that this file should be run by node. Down here, we immediately call the main function from our dist. And then all we do in this file is call that main function with the arguments that were provided, and then when the command exits, process exit 0 as it was successful. And then after that, the first thing that occurs is the index file from the distribution folder is called, and that'll be here in our source folder as it's not compiled from TypeScript yet. And down here, this main function, all it does is it first checks the connection to the database to make sure that nothing happens if the connection fails. And then we check our subcommand. If our subcommand is manage, we run the manage function. If it's take, we run take and report. Then the default command, if something that's not understood is typed in, or if nothing is typed in, we return the help command so that the user can understand which function they might want to call. And within each of these commands, we have the run manage, run take, and run report functions exported. So under manage, you can see at the very bottom we have run manage exported, which goes through and asks the user what they want to do, and then based off of that answer, it calls the sub function within this file. And same thing for report. And take is the only exclusion because when you run take, you immediately hop into taking the exam, so all of that code happens.
The database schema is pretty simple overall. We only have 4 tables, being the questions, the question choices, the responses, and the response answers. The questions table simply has a identifier in it for each question so that we can look up each question uniquely. The prompt that's being asked, whatever the user inputted when they were creating the question, the order that it appears in the survey. Then the question choices has an ID for each question choice that's used in the response answers table. The question ID, which is fetched from the questions table, is a foreign key. And then the value, which is whatever the user inputted when they were creating the question as well for the answer choices. The responses table has a unique ID for each user. This entire table is simply just metadata. And then the user ID is the name that the user inputted at the beginning. And then the submission timestamp that they submitted to that. And then we can use that for looking at when each user submitted their survey. The responses answers. The response ID is a foreign key to the responses table. And the question ID and the response ID together are a composite key so that we can use the response ID multiple times, but only once per question ID. And the question ID is taken from the questions table, with the choice ID coming from the question choices table.
The Docker file is nice because it allowed us to test our application with a database all in one go. So first we pull from the Node 14 package library. So we always have Node installed and it has the version 14 installed for us. And then after that, we install the MySQL database along with the MySQL client, clean up after ourselves, and then remove any of the package dependencies afterwards so that the Docker file isn't unnecessarily bloated with things that we don't need anymore after the install. After we install the database, we hop into the work directory of /app. That's where we want to install our application. And after that, we copy over our package.json in our yarn lock files, as that allows us to install the packages that we need. After we install the package list dependency files, we run yarn, and that will actually install all of our dependencies. After that, we copy everything from this root folder into /app. That'll include these package.json and yarn log files again, which is fine because Docker is smart enough to know not to. And then after that, it will install our source directory and pretty much everything else here. After that, yarn build is ran, and then the entry point file will be run when the Docker file is actually run. And the entry point file basically has 2 things. All it does is it starts the SQL server, it runs the initialization file, which Daniel went over earlier, and then immediately pumps you into a sh command line interface so that you can type in the survey command or any other command for the system after the Docker file starts.